Good evening, everybody. Very great pleasure to see you all this evening. So after our special visit to Mars last week, we're back on terra firma tonight, but probing nevertheless, and on a topic that has consumed us for many years. And in fact, I would say probably exacerbated by Jeremy Corbyn and Momentum. So it's my very great pleasure to welcome as our guest speaker this evening to Kenton, Michael Whine. And he has tremendous expertise in the field of anti-Semitism and human rights. And he has a remarkable biography. He is the UK member of the ECRI, which is the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. And this is the standing commission of the Strasbourg-based Council of Europe, which advises member states on human rights matters. In 2019, he was elected as a member of the ECRI Executive, and in 2020, he chaired the ECRI Working Group on General Policy Recommendations on Combating Anti-Semitism. And since 2020, he's acted as senior consultant to the World Jewish Congress. In 1986, he was co-founder of the Community Security Organization of the Board of Deputies, which subsequently became the CST, and where he managed all the departments. He's a former lay advisor to the Crown Prosecution Service, Counter-Terrorism Division, and is a member of the UK Government Independent Hate Crime Advisory Group. So please welcome Michael. So Michael, if you'd like to unmute yourself then.
Of course. Good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, you've read out some of the things that I wanted to talk about. I'll go back over them, but with a bit of explanation. This evening came about because Priscilla Dale is a friend of mine. We're members of a Jewish walking group. And in fact, they're all in the Isle of Wight for our first trip away from London in 18 months. But I'm just too busy to go and join them. But it was Priscilla who sort of twisted my arm and made me promise to talk to her shul, even though she's not present, although she may be watching it on her laptop from Sandown. Anyway, let me talk both about the problem that we face as members of the Jewish community and also about my own story and my role, which Priscilla thought might be of interest, but it also explains how I got to be where I am now. So, 1986, I was asked to be one of the co-founders of what was the CSO, the Community Security Organization, and at the same time, Defense and Group Relations Director at the Board of Deputies. And I did these two jobs, although the CST subsequently emerged out of the CSO, but I did the board's work as well for 25 years, where I was Defense and Group Relations Director. And because of that, much of my work was with other European Jewish communities. And as a consequence, I became the board's representative on the executive of both the European Jewish Congress and of the World Jewish Congress. I'll explain what they both do. I mean, the European Jewish Congress is the umbrella body for Jewish communities in Europe. That's the greater Europe, not just the EU. And the World Jewish Congress does the same thing, but on a world scale. The EJC is headquartered in Brussels. It's quite a small staff. The World Jewish Congress has got offices all over, and we've got about 100 staff. I'm not full-time staff member. I'm employed on a 50% basis, and I deal with strategic and security issues for them, notably with the European Commission and the United Nations Office for Counter-Terrorism, and I'll come to that a little bit in a minute. because of all this work with the EJC, they asked me to represent them at the first international intergovernmental meeting dealing with anti-Semitism, which was organized in 2003 in Vienna by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I need to explain that, and I'll explain all these other organizations as I go along. The OSCE emerged out of what was called the Helsinki process, whereby the East and the West disarmed. That whole process of nuclear disarmament was called the Helsinki process, and it was managed by an organization called the Committee for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was based in Helsinki. A few years later, Whine on, it became the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, an intergovernmental organization based in Vienna, dealing with disarmament, counterterrorism, and so on. I was sent by the British government as part of their delegation to meetings in Vienna, primarily on terrorism, because we just had the attack on the World Trade Center in New York, and governments were scrabbling around for A, legislation, B, what to do. And so I was part of the British government delegation at this meeting. In parallel with all of that, the OSCE, having essentially dealt with nuclear disarmament, although it raises its ugly head once again now under Putin, but because it essentially had dealt with that issue quite satisfactorily. I mean, the Warsaw Pact, which was Soviet Union and the associated states, and NATO, USA, UK, European Union, had successfully reduced their stock of nuclear arms. And so they looked around for what was called the sort of the softer route to dealing with tension between the different blocs. And this was called the human dimension of countering extremism and terrorism. And the OSCE, founded about 2001, a human rights organization called the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. In my world, you get used to these acronyms, and there are more and more of them, and they get longer and longer, which reminds me that ECRI is known as ECRI. Nobody calls it ECRI, and they certainly don't call it the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. I mean, that's really too much of a mouthful, but I'll explain what that does in a minute. So the OSCE set up the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. It's headquartered in Warsaw, and that was persuaded to follow that first meeting in Vienna with an intergovernmental conference in Berlin in 2004. Primarily because of American pressure, and America is one of the leading states and provides more of the budget for the OSCE than anybody else. They have a great influence on the OSCE. And countries are represented at the OSCE by diplomatic delegations led by ambassadors. So 2004, we had the Berlin Conference on Anti-Semitism, at which the OSCE was given the mandate to combat anti-Semitism, the first mandate given to an intergovernmental organization to combat anti-Semitism. I mean, this was all groundbreaking stuff at the time. And the Berlin Conference agreed that the member states, and there are 56 member states of the OSCE, would combat anti-Semitism, and at subsequent conferences, which took place pretty much on an annual basis, they worked out the parameters that they would persuade states to monitor anti-Semitism, they would provide training for them to do it, or their police forces to do it. They would look at how to counter anti-Semitism in the cultural and education sphere. So they set about establishing work parties and so on, primarily composed of their own staff and senior staff from the big Jewish organizations. That's the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, and me representing the CST. And essentially, and I cut a long story short here, the OSCE is responsible for training cops in Europe to monitor anti-Semitism. And that brings me to another of the problems. A, getting governments to acknowledge that they have the duty to counter anti-Semitism. Secondly, to put in place the means to do so. And thirdly, to train cops and prosecutors and teachers to do it. So we set about putting in place all of these things. And it's taken pretty much until now to do it because the process is a very, very slow one. And you have to have a lot of patience. But what we have now, and I was very involved with this together with a very senior British policeman and some contacts in America, in working out a program to train police. It's called the Words into Action program. And through Words into Action, we normally go to the country and we work over a couple of days with policemen and prosecutors and security service personnel to recognize anti-Semitism, because lots of people don't recognize it. We do, but they don't. And remember that in most European countries, if you exclude France, Germany, and the UK, the Jewish communities are tiny. In some cases, you're talking about hundreds or a couple of thousand. They were all wiped out by the Nazis. So there's nobody there. And of course, they've all got contacts with Israel, but essentially they've got no domestic Jewish communities. So we had to train policemen to recognize anti-Semitism. We had to tell them about Jewish life. What's a synagogue? What happens in a synagogue? What do Jews do in a synagogue? Because many policemen will never have met a Jew. They certainly won't have been inside a synagogue. So all of this had to be done. It all had to be laid down, and it takes a long time, but you can go on the OSCE website and look up Words into Action, and you'll find the security manual, which basically tells policemen and prosecutors all about these things that I'm talking about. They have a luach going forward about another 10 years, so policemen will know when the Chagim are, lots of other things. A lot of the stuff is drawn from CST publications, particularly the security manual, the sort that we use here to secure synagogues and Jewish schools. But it's a manual for policemen, and it's been translated now into about 10 languages. The Italian police translated it into Italian of their own accord, because the Italian police have played a big role in all of this development. It's translated into French, it's translated into German, Serbian, so on, Russian, so on and so forth. So that's what, that's one of my main areas of focus. And since last year, we worked out a new program for 10 European states where we would run the Words into Action program for the police, the prosecutors, in some cases, security services, the MI5 equivalents, and Jewish community security personnel, because they have to learn to work together, just as we do here. Of course, because of the pandemic, we've had to do it online. So we have Zoom conferences, which are shortened. Instead of being 2 days, we've had to shorten it to 1 day, and it's not really as good as it could be if we do it that way. And we're hoping to return to face-to-face Words into Action sessions as soon as we can. But in the last 3 months, we've done Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia, all of which have Jewish communities. I mean, people are not necessarily members of schools, but they're registered members of the communities. Or if they're not registered members of the community, they're Jewish, they acknowledge it, and they want to be associated. So we've brought these people together and we've run the sessions. We're now going in September, either before or after Rosh Hashanah, to Lithuania and Estonia. We're negotiating now with Latvia. And then in the autumn, we'll do what's called the Visegrad countries. That's the Central European countries of Poland, Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia. And then I've got a verbal agreement, although of course it's dependent on funding, and the money comes from governments because this is extra budgetary, to do the rest of the OSCE member states over the course of the next couple of years. And then we have to go back. We have to do 2 or 3 sessions. You train a class of policemen and 12 months later, they've all moved on. They've been promoted. They've gone somewhere else to another department of the police. So you've got to start all over again. So I think I've probably got a job for life there, but it's certainly a major element in the OSCE ODIHR program of work. They broadened it as well beyond the security area, which is what I specialize in. And together with UNESCO and Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Education Department of University College London, they have written manuals for teachers, both at primary level, secondary level, university administrators, on how to teach about anti-Semitism. This is only now being launched, so probably nobody outside of our world knows about these things, but they will be launched properly in the autumn. And they're fairly big undertakings, as you can imagine. Which brings me to UNESCO, because the perception, I think, in the Jewish community here is that UNESCO is totally anti-Israel, because you hear of resolutions being passed by UNESCO delegates which have an enormous focus on Israel, disproportionate. And that's true. But at the same time, the staff are fantastic, and their work on Holocaust education is, I would say, the best in the world, even comparable to that of Yad Vashem. But they're not doing it in the UK, they're not doing it in France, they're doing it in Asia, they're doing it in Africa, and so on. So we have a very close relationship with UNESCO, and it's really paying off. Let me come to the Council of Europe, and I need to explain it because everybody, including British government ministers, get it mixed up with the European Commission. Moreover, it's got departments that have virtually the same name as those of the European Commission. So the senior body in the European Union, which is the body above the European Commission, is the European Council, or the Council of the European Union. But that's not the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe is the oldest of the European institutions. It was founded with the urging of Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle, and was initiated in the London Conference in 1947 by Ernest Bevin. Which is really very strange, but they determined that Europe, after the end of the war, would be governed by a human rights regime, a regime based not on Nazism or fascism or the other variants of totalitarian state, but by a regime which owed its founding to human rights years. And it quickly established the European Court of Human Rights, and at the same time the European Convention of Human Rights. And in fact, the Council of Europe is the convention holder for Europe. These are intergovernmental agreements which have the force of law and have to be ratified by governments and then transferred into domestic legislation. So the Council of Europe essentially is the lawmaker in the field of human rights and related fields for the Council member states, and those are 47 member states. Remember, the EU is 27, Council of Europe is 47, and the OSCE, because it involves the USA and Canada as well, is 56. So these are the three intergovernmental groupings that are relevant in my work. So the Council of Europe deals with human rights, and it works through different media. Firstly, there's a parliamentary association, or parliamentary assembly of the Council of Europe, which is not the European Parliament, parliamentary assembly, and members of it are members of Parliament appointed by their parliaments. So UK appoints 5 or 6 of its members, including the Scottish Parliament, to represent them at the Council of Europe. And that's called PACE, Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. And then it's got a number of standing commissions, working commissions. And I'm a member of this one, ECRI, and each country has one member. You are required to nominate a member, but our appointment is by the foreign ministers. So my appointment is by the foreign ministers of Europe, and we are the monitoring bureau on human rights for the Council of Europe. And we do this in 2 ways. Firstly, country visits. We visit each country every 5 years, and our investigations are incremental. So we look at what we said 5 years ago, what recommendations we made, what Council of Europe policies are, and we inspect the country on that basis. And these inspections are quite intrusive. I would expect government ministers, I would expect to meet civil servants, senior civil servants. I would expect to meet a range of relevant non-governmental organizations. And because ECRI has in its title, in its strapline, anti-Semitism, I would expect to meet the leaders of the Jewish community. But when we meet civil society groups, in other words, non-government we do so in private. We don't tell the government who we're meeting, we don't tell them when. And a lot of our work, because it's at the governmental level, is what is done in what's known as camera. It's done in camera. In other words, it's confidential. All our discussions are confidential between ourselves and with the governments. And they only become public when we publish our reports. And it takes about a year from the time we decide, right, we're going to country A to inspect it. We would be there for a week. There might possibly be a follow-up visit, but there's an enormous amount of paperwork that has to be gone through. We have to go through all the legislation. We have to look at what they've signed up to internationally and so on. So it's a big job. It's really quite tiring. I've now done 3 country visits in the last few years, and this autumn I'm doing another country visit, and because I've been there for 8 years, I'm now regarded as fairly senior, so I have to lead the delegation, which means that we send 2 or 3 members of ECRI together with our own legal staff and translators. And I say we have quite intrusive discussions with government. And of course, my focus is particularly on anti-Semitism, although I've actually become an in-house expert on the Romani and Gypsy communities of Europe as well. I've had to inspect 3 Romani encampments in different European countries over the last few years. Believe me, sometimes that's not pleasant because some countries treat Gypsies still, Romani still, like they were dirt. So the places in which they live and the schooling which is provided for their kids is really not particularly good. So one way we work is through country inspections on a 5-yearly basis, and about a year after we've done the inspection, we publish the country report. And these are the standard human rights report on a country. And all the other agencies, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, and all the others rely on our reports. They're the standard reports on human rights in a particular country. The other way we do it is by drafting General Policy Recommendation. And these are advisories to governments on how to deal with an issue. And I've just chaired for the last year the working group, which is renewing the General Policy Recommendation No.9 on combating anti-Semitism. It's about 25 pages long, and in it, we very briefly explain the history of anti-Semitism, including contemporary anti-Semitism, because as we'll come on to in a minute, the directions from which anti-Semitism is coming are changing, and the way in which it's promoted are changing. So General Policy Recommendation, we finished it last week after a year of discussion, Zoom discussions, consultations with the other international agencies, the United Nations Human Rights Committee, UNESCO, the European Commission. Many states, including the UK, have appointed envoys or commissioners or government advisors on anti-Semitism. So we had to consult some of them. We consulted some of the presidents of Jewish communities and Council of Europe staff as well. So it's been a pretty arduous job. We didn't all start, there's only 5 of us on the working group. We didn't all start from the same place. There are 2 of us out of the 5 who are Jewish, but the other guy is secular, and he was not as engaged as he might have been, although the others were very engaged. Their English wasn't very good, they weren't Jewish. I had to explain lots of things which you and I would take for granted. I had to explain from the beginning, but one was a very senior international lawyer, so we needed her, we relied on her for her legal input, and one was the chairman of the Human Rights Commission of her country, the equivalent of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission in the UK. So fairly senior people. I have to say that most members of ECRI, myself not included, are judges. So most of my colleagues are Supreme Court or High Court judges or senior prosecutors. I mean, the permanent prosecutors of the Supreme Courts of their countries. I'm one of the few who's not a lawyer or a judge, but nevertheless, I've got some background in this area, which goes back 35 plus years. So actually, I feel outranked most of the time because when they're discussing law, I get left behind. But nevertheless, they elected me to chair this particular thing, and they also elected me to the executive of ECRI, and it's a 5-year appointment, which you can do 3 times. I will have done by 2023, I would have done 2 5-year terms. I'm hoping that I will do a 3rd, which will take me to quite senior age, but I really do enjoy it, and it's fascinating work, and I feel I'm doing some good. The next area where I work, and I haven't mentioned this, which is IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, another international organization, intergovernmental agency, based on the Stockholm Agreement, which is 26 years old now. The Swedish Prime Minister at that time felt that the world wasn't doing enough to commemorate the Holocaust, and brought together Tony Blair and the US President and other heads of state at a meeting in Stockholm, and they founded the Stockholm Declaration, which member states or signatory states pledged to commemorate the Holocaust. That changed its name, and it's now IHRA. It was something else before that. It's now IHRA. It works at the intergovernmental level. There are 34 member states. They're represented by government delegations, and there are more states joining, but it takes a few years for a government to become a liaison member and then a full member, but certainly it's growing, and they have been looking at both anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, one of the emerging arenas for promoting anti-Semitism. So they published, you may have read about this, it's a lot of publicity about it, the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. They also did one on Holocaust denial, because if you're combating something, you not only have to measure it, you have to define it. If you're dealing with anti-Semitism, what is anti-Semitism? Particularly in a world which may not understand anti-Semitism, certainly may not understand anti-Semitism now in 2021. They understood it 1939 to 1945, but not now. It's coming from different directions. It's coming from the extreme left. It's coming from Islamists. It's coming a lot from Iran. It was coming from Arab states. They're all slowly moving away from this. You know, the Saudis have apologized for that. A couple of Arab states are teaching the Holocaust. There's been enormous movement on the international scene in governments and states' view of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. So ECRI, I helped draft not the working definition of Holocaust denial or of anti-Semitism, or I did the one on anti-Semitism, but another document which is looking at how states can deal with it. How do you combat anti-Semitism? How do you combat Holocaust denial? Again, these documents, they're all publicly available. You can find them on websites of the organizations, but essentially they're meant for governments. They give guidance to governments as to how they should deal with it. Legislation, education, law enforcement training, and so on. So ECRI, the ICT, another organization you might not have heard of. It's the Israeli Institute for Counterterrorism, again, working primarily at government level, but it distills in an academic environment. It's part of an independent university, the IDC in Herzliya. It publishes stuff on terrorism and counterterrorism. It organizes an annual conference, and I've been very involved in that because I was really interested and concerned to ensure that governments understood that terrorism has a particular anti-Jewish element. I mean, I don't have to tell you about all the attacks on shuls in America, in Europe, Brussels, Paris, Copenhagen. There is a very specific anti-Semitic element in both Nazi terrorism and in jihadi Islamist terrorism. So I sort of helped run that program at ICT. I mean, they have their own staff, academic staff, but I was running workshops for them to train or to advise, to teach government representatives, policemen coming to Israel from around the world. And lastly, or almost lastly, as I say, as you heard, I was appointed by the World Jewish Congress as its senior consultant, coming up to a year ago now. I'm not on the full-time staff. I act as a consultant. I give them about 50% of my time. And there, again, I'm working at the strategic level. There are standing committees within the European Union, within the European Commission, that deal with anti-Semitism. There is the Working Group on Anti-Semitism of the European Commission. It's a senior level, what's known as high-level committee, government representatives, Jewish community representatives, Jewish think tank representatives, and I represent the World Jewish Congress. I'm one of two representatives of the World Jewish Congress at that. And for example, my work is often drafting documents. So I've just drafted a fairly substantial document for the European Commission because they are working now on what's called a strategy to implement two declarations made at the most senior level within the European Union, the declaration, the Council declarations on combating anti-Semitism. And they need a process by which they implement these declarations, which are agreed at not head of state, but prime ministerial or foreign ministerial level. So all of this might be quite new to all, most, if not all of you. And a lot of this doesn't get much publicity because a lot of it is at the intergovernmental level. But there is an enormous amount going on. And that, I think, marks the difference between now and, say, 20 years ago. That whilst anti-Semitism is mounting, and it's coming from different directions, particularly from the left, from the Islamists, as well as the extreme right, government's abilities and the putting in place of practical means to combat this have been much, much slower. And often they rely on copying what's called best practice. One government gets a good idea dealing with terrorism, so they would want to spread it, and they would do it through these means, through the intergovernmental agencies, or through Europol, or through Interpol. So a lot of my work is focused on that. So I see my role increasingly as assisting police, governments, and the international agencies to apply the agreements they've entered into to combat anti-Semitism and hate crime. So in a sense, you can look at all of this situation as a split screen. Why are we doing so badly when we're doing so well? Because anti-Semitism is definitely growing in most countries. The number of incidents is mounting year on year. It's true, the number of terrorist attacks declined last year, but that wasn't for want of trying. It was because of lockdown and because police and Jewish communities are guarding their institutions. So we had a very substantial fall. In fact, we had no terrorist attacks against Jewish communities. But that's not to say that plots weren't being foiled, weren't being hatched, but they were being foiled. So this is really where I see my work at the moment. The last thing I do, which is a domestic thing, although Priscilla said I should focus on the international scene, is within the UK. And Rochelle mentioned that I was a member of the CPS, or the Hate Crime Independent Advisors Group of the government, and I do the same thing for the Crown Prosecution Service. So what I do, together with a couple of colleagues, is I go into the police files, I go into police computers, and I look through their records, the crime records, the witness statements. How have they managed their job? How are they dealing with hate crime? Are they investigating it properly? Are they following procedures? Are they taking witness statements? Are they doing it in good time? Because if justice isn't served quickly, it's not justice. So a lot of my work now is on this. And for example, I'll finish with this, 2 examples. I was part of the advisory team of HM Inspectorate of Constabulary. Only Britain has an Inspectorate of Constabulary, noch a Majesty's one as well. And they are the governing body, the inspecting body for all British police forces. And we did an inspection, or they did an inspection of how British police forces are dealing with hate crime, including anti-Semitism. And I was part of the panel that was advising them. And then 2 weeks ago, I went to a particular police force in Britain, and I sat for 2 days at the computer together with a detective, and I went through all their crime records. How had they dealt with this crime on that day? Somebody was attacked because they were black. Could we determine that that was the motivating factor? Could we determine that the police had recorded it properly? Had they filled out the forms properly? As you know, police work is all about filling out forms and sending them on to the next level. Had the first responders, the cops who arrived in the police car on the motorbike at the scene, done the right thing? Had the witness statements been taken properly? Had they been passed on to the Crown Prosecution Service properly? So, you know, this is what I do in the UK, and that's pretty much all I do in the UK now, because most of my work is abroad. So, I mean, essentially, that's both the work I do and the journey that I've undertaken to get there. If you've got questions, throw them at me.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yep.
Go ahead, Roy.
Hello, Mike. It's Roy Block here. I have memories of when you used to come and teach us.
I recognise you. Yes.
Kingston School. I haven't changed, have I?
Not at all.
I knew you'd say that.
Very
Look
complimentary.
as young as you always
I'm
did.
impressed. Thank you. I'm impressed by the list of countries that you've had some impact on, but there seems a big gap in Canada and America where they don't seem to take security too seriously at all. I've been to many a Jewish building in Canada and America, and you know they're oblivious to security issues.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how you can
Yeah.
help them.
Well, they're different countries, maybe adjacent to one another, but they're very different. Canada has a CST equivalent, but it's not particularly strong. It's not particularly developed. Monitoring anti-Semitism is split between different organizations. B'nai B'rith League for Human Rights and the representative body, and security is done by somebody else. And they don't quite get their act together, although they're improving. And there's a realization, in fact, Canada is in the process now of legislating to deal with these issues. I was looking at Canadian draft legislation a few weeks ago on behalf of the Jewish community. America's a different country. Jews in America thought that they were immune, that anti-Semitism was something they'd left behind in Europe, or their grandparents had left behind in Europe, and they've been really shocked by what's happened in the last few years. There's a realization that they can be as vulnerable as we once were. There are two Jewish organizations dealing with security of communities, the SCAN, which provides an early warning system, which was founded and run by ex-cops, Jewish cops, but they don't do building security like CST does. So there's another organization which is based on CST, where we trained them, and I went to New York twice to run training for them. But it's very slow. It's very slow in America. There's a tendency of American Jewish communities to think if they pay an off-duty cop to stand outside their front door, they've dealt with security. But if you've worked with CST, you know it's more than just standing outside a building and looking like a starker, even if you're not. There's a lot more to it than that. So they're gradually, I'm afraid, having to learn the hard way. Yeah. Go to any European Jewish community and they will have a CST equivalent. They will certainly have police. I don't know if you read in the, I think in the JC in the last week or so, that the Belgian government is withdrawing the army protection from the Jewish community. In France, they've still got the army, or they've had until fairly recently, the army guarding shuls. Frankly, no government can afford to have soldiers guarding a shul. It's best left to policemen and to community volunteers. And the police have to be trained. And we saw, for example, in the attack on the shul in Denmark, in Copenhagen, that the police weren't up to the task. They really messed it up really badly. So you've got to have policemen who are trained for the job.
I've been to shuls in Europe and have been given a real hard time to get in, particularly in Copenhagen. And yet the complete opposite in America, specifically following the outrageous attack on the shul in Pittsburgh. Following that, there's no different. It's still an open house policy.
I know. What can you do? But I went to shul. I had a conference with the Italian police, who are terrific. The Carabinieri, the National Carabinieri, are terrific. They've got a colonel there who has led on this, and he's been terrific with the Jewish community. He's done everything that they could have wanted. I decided I was in Rome. The police headquarters are just outside Rome. I went a couple of days early. I'm very friendly with the head of security of the Rome community. I said, I want to go to shul on Friday night. I've never been to shul on Friday night. So I get there. There are army, there are armed, there are tanks outside the shul, and soldiers, and the Jewish community's own volunteer guards, all armed, and a really high and tough wire fence, and you had to go through, you know, the metal detectoring arches in order to get to shul. But when I got there, there was a queue, mostly visiting Israeli tourists. There were about 25 of them, and I got there a bit later, so I was at the end. But they came along, queue saying, "Who's Michael Whine? Who's Michael Whine? Ah, right, you come with us." And I jumped the queue and I was in first. I was astonished to see these armored cars and tanks outside. I don't know if anybody knows the shul in Rome. It's a model of St. Peter's, the Vatican, but on a smaller scale. It's a vast building. It's really grandiose. It's beautiful. And there's sort of like a piazza in front of it. And these armored cars. I mean, I don't know what they thought they were going to be doing with armored cars. If a terrorist came with a bomb strapped to his belt, they're going to blow him up with a tank, you know, but that was overkill.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks, Roy. Of course, anybody else like to ask a question to Michael?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, certainly.
Last year, there was, sorry, Bernard Altman. Okay.
Go on,
Last
go ahead.
year, I remember in America. Sorry.
Yeah.
I can't hear you.
Last year, I remember in New York, there was a riot by certain black groups against Jewish businesses. They smashed the shops and all that kind of thing. Yeah. And I wonder if you've mentioned anti-Semitism on the right and jihadists, but I get the feeling that there's a lot of anti-Semitism amongst certain black groups, including Black Lives Matter, and particularly that group, I think it was a religious group that smashed up those shops in New York last year. Are these problems recognised?
Yes. It's problematic in America because the Jews were the community that first and most effectively supported the campaign for black rights, human rights. Remember, Rabbonim marched with Martin Luther King and were always active in that struggle, more than anybody else. Over the years, particularly with the rise of black nationalism and black power. I'm not saying that Jews and blacks in America don't get on well. They do in many places, but certainly it's become fractured. And in New York and a couple of other cities, the problem is exacerbated by the rubbing up of the two communities against each other. If you go to Brooklyn, for example, Williamsburg and some of the Jewish suburbs of Brooklyn, you see that the Jews and the blacks are living like that, right close up to one another, particularly the Haredi community. And whilst they got on reasonably well for many years, that relationship is becoming particularly fractured. Black Lives Matter is something different. Although it sees the imagination and it's still got a lot of Jewish support, the founders of it, the three women that founded Black Lives Matter, all came out of the American Communist Party. And they brought with them those attitudes that they would have developed within the Communist Party, but they also were influenced very early on by Palestinian activists, and two of them went to the West Bank and to Gaza on extended tours there and came back firmly wedded to the Palestinian cause. So it's a difficult relationship. I hope that with goodwill on both sides, they can calm it. But certainly Orthodox Jews, Haredi Jews, and poor blacks living alongside one another, particularly where a lot of the property is owned by Jews, the slum landlords, is not a good recipe for sort of mutual benefit.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bernard. Have I got any more questions?
I'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back to that cavalcade of anti-Semitic Palestinian cars that drove all the way up from Finchley Road, from Swiss Cottage, up to Golders Green Station, turned left, went down Golders Green Road, shouting Jewish obscenities to women and men, particularly women, and no action at all from the police. Doesn't mean there's no police around or they couldn't be bothered.
Well, no action was taken at the time. They've since been charged. First, you've got to identify them, which isn't always possible in a demonstration or in a moving vehicle. So you've got to identify them, and then you've got to charge them, and you've got to establish that you've got enough evidence to charge them and take a case to court. So these, I mean, that's why invariably when you see an anti-Jewish march through London, as we used to see, we don't now, but we used to see every year on Quds Day, which was the day that Ayatollah Khomeini decreed that Muslims should protest about Israeli governance of Jerusalem and should demonstrate against Israel. There were never any arrests on those demonstrations, nor indeed were there when Israel went into Gaza in 2009, 2014, where there were violent demonstrations in London. The police will tend not to arrest on the spot. Because they could provoke a riot, because somebody will obviously try and stop the police from preventing, from arresting, and you're going to get a fight on the streets, and the police want to prevent that. So they would rather rely on identifying the people, which they can do very, very thoroughly, ways that I don't want to go into, and then subsequently arrest them. So those people in those cars who drove through Golders Green Road have since been charged.
Thanks very much, Michael. That's encouraging.
Thanks very much, Barry. Do we have any more questions for Michael?
Can I ask a question, please?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. I know that the CST help with getting places to have secure windows and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
How does that work in other countries as well?
There is a European agreement that governments should fund security measures for Jewish communities. It's not the duty of Jewish communities to pay for their own security. That is the role of government. It's the government's duty to protect its citizens, all of its citizens. So in the UK, the CST manages a government fund which pays for windows and for man guarding at Jewish schools. It's done slightly differently in other countries, but nevertheless, it's done. In most countries, most major Jewish communities now have got security hardware funded by their governments. If not, then the World Jewish Congress or the Jewish Agency will pay for it. But really, there will be pressure on European Union states over the course of the next year to fund security hardware for their Jewish communities. It's part of the European Council Declaration of 2018. And as I said, I'm working on the strategy. I'm one of the people working on the strategy to implement that. In other words, to ensure that governments pay for it and not the Jewish communities. Funding security hardware and security personnel places an enormous burden on Jewish communities. Some communities some of the smaller communities are spending a third, half of their budget on security, which means they've got no money for education, they've got no money for all the things you would expect a Jewish community to be involved in. It's insupportable. That's the job of government.
So is that why some of the smaller provincial communities have joined the United Synagogue?
I've no idea. I've no idea. But CST doesn't care whether they're liberal, united, majority, or what. We even deal with the Haredi community. They are all Jewish communities, full stop.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Do you have any further questions for Michael?
Not me,
Can't
no.
Can't see a hand up.
I think Gilda has a hand up.
Oh, Gilda. Go ahead, Gilda. Let's unmute yourself.
Hello, Mike. I remember you from over 30 years ago.
Oh, that's very nice.
Are you Martin's wife?
Pardon?
You're Martin's wife?
Yeah, Martin's. Well, when you were involved with Martin and the CST and the CSO, Board of Deputies Defence Committee. And I just wanted to remember.
Well, of course I remember. One of your daughters within CST.
Oh, yes, Jocelyn was, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Aye.
It was very interesting, your life since then.
Yes, it's taken on a turn I never expected.
Yeah.
30 years ago, 35 years ago.
Yeah.
It's over 30 years, isn't it?
It is. It's 35 years that I worked for the CST, but I was involved well before then. I was involved when I was at school.
Yeah. It's nice seeing you again.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Gilda. Do you have any, can't see any hands up at the moment. Anything, Maurice, can you see? Anyone? No. Well, Michael, we've been very privileged this evening to hear you speak, and it's remarkable the high level of engagement that you have with so many different countries in your specialised fields. And it's fascinating to us, actually, to see how you monitor the anti-Semitism and human rights. And of course, education, training of the police and prosecutors in their particular roles is absolutely crucial. And I was quite fascinated by how you're actually inspecting the various countries as well. So thank you very much indeed for giving us the pleasure of hearing you speak this evening, which is a very important and vital topic for the Jewish community, and particularly for ours as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.